Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We always love to talk about Artemas and Sarah. We are here today to learn about General Artemas Ward, a man of whom John Adams said he was universally esteemed, beloved, and confided in by his army and his country. And he's all ours from Shrewsbury. I am privileged to be his wife. I was born Sarah Trowbridge in 1724 and grew up in Groton, Massachusetts. I am the daughter of the Reverend Caleb and Hannah Trowbridge. Through my mother, I am a direct descendant of Increase Mather and John Cotton. Increase Mather was a New England Puritan clergyman in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and president of Harvard College for 20 years, the years being 1681 to 1701. Now later on you'll see what an importance early on Harvard College was to actually the settling of Shrewsbury as well as other towns. John Cotton, my other family member, was a clergyman from England. He left England in 1633 because he did not like the ceremony associated with the established Church of England. The congregation had nothing to say about it. It was just all these other people telling them what to believe. He wanted to preach in a simpler manner, and so he did in his Boston church. Later in his career, he was studying and modifying the way the New England churches were governed. He gave the name Congregationalism to the form of church government which involved the people of the congregation. And here we sit in the First Congregational Church of Shrewsbury. Want to show that?
Sure.
Before a town could be incorporated in New England at this period, they had to have passed certain requirements, and they're shown up there on the wall up there. You need 40 families, you need a church, you need a trained minister, and you need land for a school. The meeting requirements were set up by the General Court. It was hard work and required persistence on the part of the settlers. When you say they needed 40 families, that means they had to have houses built, they had to have fields made available for their crops, laying out a lot of lots, building homes and barns, clearing lands for fields. Area set aside for the church was called the Rocky Pine Plain. The church was erected in 1723. It was very plain and very small. Job Cushing was called to be our first minister in 1723 and served 37 years. The large hall on the basement level of our church is Cushing Hall. Shrewsbury was incorporated in 1727. That meant that it followed all the requirements that it was necessary to have the church. One of them, as you remember, was to have an educated minister. And this is where the Harvard College, comes in. Harvard was training ministers so that they could go out into the Massachusetts towns and start their churches.
Right there.
And there is Harvard College. And that's one of the first buildings? Yep. It was there when you were there?
Yes.
Okay.
I was born.
It took us 10 years, as I said, in Shrewsbury to finally become a town, and we were incorporated in 1727. Oh, 1727 was also the birth of Artemas Ward. So the town, Shrewsbury, and the gentleman, Artemas Ward, shared the same birth year.
My turn. And if we look, I don't know, can you hear me? I will make sure you can hear me.
2 microphones.
The original 3 or 4 decades saw a lot of change in this church. So from 1727, with its founding, up until Job Cushing passed away, there were a lot of changes. Some of the changes we note, this is a very rural section of New England. Actually, nobody lived here to speak of in the beginning. And the reason for that is because it was unsettled. It wasn't that we were creating a new town beside an old town. They just kept moving west. So this really was a frontier. People moved by carriage. They moved slowly. It took 2 full days to get into Boston. So when I later became a representative, it would take me 2 days. I would stop at the Wayside Inn, spend the night, have a good meal, and then continue on into Boston. And this is the home that I grew up in. It's still there today. This one, however, has been embellished upon. Originally, if you look at that from the front, over on the right side, you can see that there are 2, 4, 6, 7 windows upstairs. If you cut that right down in the middle, the original house that my parents and I grew up in was half that size, with no back. The back shed that was added. So there were 10 of us in that small 3 or 4 bedroom house. And in a couple weeks, some of you, if you're interested, can have a tour of the house. You can also go on your own during Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I think some days it's open. And there's a huge barn in the back, which was added a bit later, but it's the largest standing barn in New England. And if you go inside, and if you privileged for them to open the doors for you, you can see 3 or 4 of my carriages. You can see a lot of the tools, and I had my sons work pretty hard, so we needed a lot of tools in case they got broken. Now, there were 3 major religious issues that I would like to mention. One is, there was in the colonial period a requirement. You had to live near the church. They want to make sure you don't slip away. And so it was approximately a mile. If you happened to move further out, they would admonish you not to do that. But over time, they lost control, and people started moving further north, which was later called the North Precinct, Boylston. Now, that area is 4 miles roughly from here, and if you're riding in a carriage to come to church and to go home, it might take you an hour, 2 hours coming and going, so that could be very time consuming and difficult to walk as well. So the parishioners who were moving further to the north petitioned the church to allow them to incorporate a new church up there. And they became, as I said, the North Parish in 1743. That's only about 16 years after Shrewsbury was actually incorporated. So in 1743, they established a new church. They built a new church. They had the Orthodox minister, Morse, Reverend Morse, up there. And but that did create some tension. The second issue had to do with church membership. In the old days, you didn't just show up and attend church and receive communion. That's unheard of back in my day. What happened was you could only petition the church to accept you if you had a letter giving you a positive release from your prior church. And if you went out, you went away from the prior church in a huff, they wouldn't accept you. So there were several members, Goddard family, for example, that tried to circumvent that system. So they went down to Hopkinton. They joined the church there because they were more forgiving. But then when the Goddards came back here from Framingham, sort of a triangulated route, the church grilled them for probably 6 or 8 years before they allowed them to be a member. And they could attend church, but they couldn't take communion. Now, I don't know about you, but there are a lot of people who feel that communion is symbolic. But in those days, I think they thought it was more than symbolic. This was your pathway to heaven. And you must take communion, or else you're not really bona fide, accepted Christian. So this church membership was basically decided by Job Cushing. So there was a big sticking point as to how much power he should have versus some of the so-called ruling elders who we think of as deacons today, people who assist in the running of the church. So that was a big issue for approximately, all of Job Cushing's tenure. So when he passed away, they passed, the ruling elders required Joseph Sumner to agree that he would share power with the ruling elders and not be autocratic. You know, some years earlier in 1688, with William and Mary in England sharing the power with Parliament in the Glorious Revolution, that was also there as well. And the last one is the debate over the doctrine of original sin. So this was an issue that if people decided they want to interpret the Bible their own way, then you couldn't do that. So we think of the Massachusetts province or colony having a lot of freedom. In some ways, yes, but theologically, they wanted everybody to believe like them. And if you didn't, you remember what happened in Hutchinson and Roger Williams. They got booted out and they went down to Rhode Island, where there was much more religious freedom. Yep. And at the end of this 30 or so period, as I was growing up, my dad decided that I had some redeeming qualities and got me a good tutor, and I passed the entrance exams into Harvard. And this is the dorm or the building called Massachusetts Hall. It's still there today. And this is where all the 100 students lived during the course of their Harvard tenure. And I was there from 1744 to 1748. And then the next year I worked on my master's degree. And shortly thereafter, I went to Groton with my degree. And I lived with a minister, Trowbridge, there in Groton, Massachusetts. And that's where I found his daughter, and we fell in love, and we got married the next year. We moved back to Shrewsbury early in the 50s. But this is just the beginning of my life and our life together. I became very active in Shrewsbury politics. I held almost every position there was. You probably know the church and the town government were the same. So that's why they called this the meeting house.
That's why they call it the meeting house.
The meeting house.
Town meetings were held here as
Yep.
well as church services.
And of course, at that time, it was a smaller church. nevertheless, it was called the Meeting House. And that was a very interesting period of time in American history in the 1750s. There was a big war going on to see who was going to rule the Western world between France, Spain, and England. It's called the 7 Years' War, sometimes called the French and Indian War. It spilled over into New England a lot. As a 28-year-old, later in the 50s, I served as a captain in the militia, which was a provincial army, served with the British up at Fort Ticonderoga. Unfortunately, we lost that battle, but it trained me into what could become my military experience for about 10 years later, when I became the first commander-in-chief of the American Revolution. So,
the second minister of the church was Joseph Sumner, called in 1762. And there is his lovely portrait. Did you have his wife's portrait?
yeah, next.
Okay. And this is Mrs. Sumner. So we'll go back to the Reverend Sumner. He served here for 63 years. During his tenure, a new church was built. Guess who the chairman of the building committee was? Artemas Ward, chairman of the building committee. The committee's purpose was to have the work well and thoroughly done, and home labor was preferred. The timbers were all selected from the Shrewsbury forests. Shrewsbury blacksmiths made the nails, and the architect himself, Daniel Hemingway, was a Shrewsbury man and a famous church builder. That building was finished in 1766.
1766 was a very big year. Can you hear me? It was a very big year in American history, particularly as a new country is about to come to life. 1766, we're building the church. You can imagine out on the common, the women are getting all the food ready. This is the way it was. And the guys are out there building away. And Artemas Ward's kind of standing on the side giving directions, kind of like the boss. At any rate, a messenger from the governor, Governor Francis Bernard, rode up to the center of town and to the common. He was on a fine horse. The messenger from the governor had a very fine uniform on, and he said, "Where is Colonel Ward?" Now, Colonel was my title at that time in the militia. This is 1766. So at that point, I said, "Here am I." And he came over and he handed me a letter from the governor. I opened it up and I read it. It was about 2 sentences long. And basically it said, "You are hereby relieved of your commission as colonel in the militia," which basically meant I was being fired. Now, I turned to my townspeople and also to parishioners who were standing there helping me build the church, who actually had some respect for me. And they said, "Artemas, what is it? What is it? Can you read it aloud?" So I read it aloud, and I read it, what I read to you. And they go, "Ooh!" And within a few minutes, I turned to the messenger, and I told the messenger, I says, "Dear sir, please go back and inform the governor that I thank him. I thanked him actually twice over, but more for this than the first time I got the commission, because being relieved of my commission shows that I am what he is not, a friend of my country." So the issue at that point, to give you a little background information after the fact, was that they were beginning to raise a lot of taxes. And the taxes were to pay for the 7 Years' War, and a lot of people did not want to pay the stamp tax. They didn't want to pay the molasses tax, the sugar tax, the tea tax, all those taxes they didn't want to pay. And Artemas Ward, right here, protested along with most of the members of the House of Representatives, or sometimes called the General Assembly in Boston. And it became such a heated issue that the governor, royal governor, appointed by the King of England, lost his favor, and within a few years he had to leave Massachusetts because he was just out of sorts with the people who lived here. But that was a very important beginning in 1766. But it was not the end of the issue of taxation. It was not even the end of the issue of who's in charge or who has the power or authority. So everything is moving, if you're familiar with some of this history, everything is moving toward a more democratic form in the churches, in the life in general. The one person making all the decisions, as in a church, are being questioned, even in the family. Because in the family, the father used to be the boss, and whatever the family's father said went, but over time, he even lost some of his authority. And you can read about this in some of the books that are out there. This period from 1766 until 1776 is a pre-revolutionary period. A lot of protest, a lot of anxiety, a lot of people. Actually, the society was somewhat divided in three ways. Those who opposed the king and all the taxes, those who thought it was a good idea, let's do it, let's be loyal British subjects, and there's a bunch of people who really may be a little uninformed, ill-informed, or were just out in the hinterland and were not aware of all that might be going on. To jump back to the 20th century a bit, when I was doing my research on Artemas Ward, I discovered that Shrewsbury, when they wrote their documents and they kept their minutes of all the meetings during the American Revolution, they only mentioned probably twice during that 4, 5, 6 year period. Only twice did they mention anything at all with the American Revolution. So to some extent, it wasn't all consuming as one might think. Nevertheless, the war did come about, as we all know. Patriots' Day became a reality, and just before April the 19th, the people in Massachusetts realized that there was going to be, let's see here. Okay, we skipped over one of those already. A lot of redcoats, thousands were being sent into the Commonwealth, or at that point, the colony of Massachusetts, particularly in 1768. Again, then, when the war broke out in 75. And here you can see some of them training in nearby areas. This was over near Barrett's Farm in Concord, where a lot of ammunition was stored, and actually a cannon that they were looking for, the British were looking for. So General Ward was appointed general from his colonel position, even though he had been relieved of that position by the governor in 1766. Some years later, the people in Massachusetts decided what they needed to do was get ready for war. So in October of 74, they decided what we're going to do is we're going to appoint some generals, we're going to start stockpiling ammunition, we're going to get barrels and barrels of flour and sides of beef and dried fish and so forth and so on, and be ready so when the war breaks out, we can have 10, 20,000 soldiers and feed them. Because if you can't feed your soldiers, you're in trouble. As commander of the American Army, there's 2 or 3 things I want to just point out. I think many of you probably know the Artemas Ward, General Ward, was the first commander-in-chief of the American Army. Now, the Army took time. The American response to the British took time to evolve. But during that time, in Cambridge, the American headquarters were created on the Common in Cambridge. And 23,000 volunteers came. It was a very large group. These are mostly farmers who had no experience except with shooting a gun to go hunting or whatever. So to train them was a monumental task. So you had to follow directions, you had to do what you were told. And on occasion, General Ward would have to admonish his volunteers, you can't go home and see your girlfriend this weekend. We got a war going here. You got to stay. So that was part of the issue. And this also, after Patriots' Day in April, a lot of them go home to plow their fields. And so they're coming and going, and he has to remind them of their duty. The second thing that I think was noteworthy is you've heard of the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill is often thought of as the British won, but actually the Americans won that battle. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, the British took the hill, they captured the flag, so to speak, so they won. Well, you could say that, but what were the results? The British lost 50% of their 2,000 soldiers that fought that day. 93 officers were killed. That's a terrible number on any side in any war. Not only that, but they now feared the Americans. The Americans fought so bravely that day that had they not run out of ammunition, they would have whooped the British and sent them back into the ocean, back across the little pond. So what happened that day really was something that is a feather in Artemas Ward's cap, because what happened was we found out from a spy, there were spies all over the place, that the British were going to attack. And when we figured they were going to attack us, what are we going to do? We are going to be prepared before they attack. So we heard they were going to attack in a week, so I was ready with the men in 3.5 days. So we sent them over to Charlestown, and we built a fortress, earthen work, like a redoubt, like just up on top of the hill with some mounds of dirt and rocks, and went out for a couple hundred yards this way and that way. So when the British came up, what did they do? Unfortunately, we were shooting down at them. It was a hot day. They were carrying 75 pounds on their backs, and we ended up just about winning that. But psychologically, they lost so many that the next time there was an opportunity, they were on the boat headed back to England, and we call that Evacuation Day, March 17th, 1776. And you can see some of the recruits right here. Well, not really, but
You were the leader.
yeah. Okay. Do you want to?
No, you can go. If you go to Washington, D.C., our fellow Shrewsburyite has a statue there, statue of General Artemas Ward.
How about the church? Church.
All right. We have two wonderful items in this room right here that go way back. Very often in a church service, the historic communion table is referred to, and that's the table in the back there, and that was from 1723, that piece of furniture. The other one is this beautiful pulpit here. It's called the Sumner pulpit, so it was here, Sumner. Now, the only thing that is different is that there were doors. I guess they wanted to keep everyone out but the minister. So they had the door here, and the door on the other side here. But those two historic pieces of our furniture are to be cherished.
Yep.
Okay. Do you have the picture of the church, first of all? The 1770? The whole orientation of this building is very interesting.
Where's the,
That doesn't,
okay. It's here somewhere.
okay.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, I'll describe it. The front part of the church was actually the long side. So the long side was here. The two shorter sides, no, is that right?
Yep.
Okay. And it goes back. So the church was oriented in an interesting way. The way they solved the problem, I always found fascinating that they were able to do this at this, but we'll get to that part in a minute.
There it is.
There it is, yes. So they entered the building from the side. 1766, that's the, okay.
And you're looking at it from the south side. So the common is over here, which is the south side. So as you look at it, it was,
The long side is facing.
Yeah.
Right, okay. In 1807, we started to do some manipulation here, and the west porch, which was that one there,
yeah,
you showing it?
yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
Was removed, and it was replaced by the steeple. The steeple is now over on that side. Also with the steeple has a bell, the bells, and they are going to eventually put a clock in, so they have the dials and all that have been put over there. Okay,
Then they turned it.
am I moving it now? The orientation is now going to change of the building. The meeting house, the one he just showed, is going to be moved. And could you put that one back on? There it is, yeah. Yep. And they're going to take,
Over here.
yes, and that's going to become the front, yeah. So they have the building there, and they're going to
Move it. Counterclockwise.
the meeting house was moved approximately 50 feet to the north and turned 1/4 around. So before, where the long sides of the church were the front and the back, those are now going to become these sides. And rightly so, because at that time in history, New England towns had greens in front, and the churches were built on the green. And so here we are now looking out on the Shrewsbury Green there, and we've got it back the way most churches in New England are. So the church was moved approximately 50 feet to the north. And when I used to give this speech to some of my students from Spring Street School, they were fascinated that this could be picked up and moved. Frankly, I was fascinated by it too. What they did too was they placed it, they had the foundation where they were going to move it to already ready to receive the church. And one of these reasons was that they wanted another floor on the bottom, was for, the word used was vestry, but it was for offices in the church. And to this day, where is our church office? Down in the basement. Okay, so the meeting house was moved approximately 50 feet to the north and turned 1/4 around, which put the steeple, which would have been facing this way, now has turned with the building, and we have the beautiful steeple in front with the clock and the, yes, there it is. And now, and frankly, the rest of the New England churches are facing the common, and so we were able to do that. Okay. Ready?
Yeah. So you can see the church has been through a lot of changes. The church has been through, you could call it democratization, egalitarian. New Englanders were known for that anyway, but over time, a lot of changes. And I think it's through a lot of these changes and these trials and tribulations that you forge a new synthesis or whatever, and that's how we move forward. So I think it's a great tribute to the members of this church who lived 100, 200, 300 years ago, that they continue to persevere and continue to work at it to make it work. And remember, in the beginning, it wasn't just a church. It was the polity, the government was here as well for the small town. And so they worked one in the same. And that's why they call it the meeting house. And there will be a tour of this, I believe, in a few weeks. Is Carol Baker here? There will be a tour in a few weeks of the building, and you can see some of the additions that have been added over the years. But the original church in 1766 is these walls and the wall behind you and the ceiling above, and it had been raised a number of feet to put the basement in as well. So there have been changes since that time. And as you wander through the church, you can see outside the chapel, which is over in that direction, pictures from the 1850s when we first had photographs, 1840s and 50s. About every 50 years, there's some big change in the church. So, do we have any questions or comments or corrections?
Yes, Jean.
No, I was actually a school teacher. School teacher. Yes.
Could you tell us about your role in the revolution? Weren't you replaced by George Washington while you were still, would it have been in Boston?
Cambridge. Yes. In the beginning, Massachusetts was the bad boy. And so consequently, we knew they were coming after us. Not Pennsylvania, not South Carolina, not Georgia, Massachusetts. We were some of the most outspoken you can imagine. Imagine Sam Adams. Well, he was as feisty then as his beer is now. So we had a lot of people who were very vehement in our rights. John Hancock was another one, made all of his money through smuggling, but became the richest man in New England. So they came after us first. So we knew here that was going to happen. We organized and got prepared, and even though the original army, those 23,000 volunteers, even though they did not come from the South, they came later from there, but we knew we had to be prepared. So Massachusetts was the driving force, hence, in a way, the selection of Ward to be the first general. Actually, it's not exactly the first general. The general who was appointed #1 never showed up. he was too old. He was infirmed, and about a month or two after Patriots Day, he sent a letter and he said, "Boys, I'm sorry I couldn't show up. I couldn't get on my horse." So I think his name was Seth Pomeroy. But nevertheless, Ward did jump right in there, and for about 3 months, he organized the Army. He got it going. He got supplies. He figured strategies. Patriots Day was on the 19th, and during the next couple months, the Continental Congress is down in Philadelphia, and they're trying to figure out what's going to happen next. What are we going to do? This is not good for us. They were very supportive, of course, of going to war with England. Not everybody, but a lot of them. And so within a matter of a few weeks, they decided they have to become more formalized. So with that, in May, Ward gets his actual his commission, excuse me. His commission as general of the American Army, and several other colonies in the area joined in with Massachusetts, namely the ones in New England. And then Bunker Hill occurs, and at that point in June, what has to happen is we need more support from our southern brethren. There were a few women that served in the Army, disguised, but most of them were brethren. Fathers, sons, uncles, grandfathers, whatever. And as a result, the Army required a new leader from the South to attract support in soldiers, money, and so forth. And they decided on George Washington, in part because as they were deciding, he's strutting around the room where they're deciding. He's 6'3", by the way. That's pretty tall back in those days. And he's strutting around in his uniform from the 7 Years' War. And, for a guy 49 years old or whatever he was, that's pretty good. He looked pretty dandy. And so they decided, well, yeah, he's right here. That's George Washington. He also was one of the largest slave owners. Not that that's a great thing, but in those days, he was well-heeled. He volunteered without any kind of pay to serve and lead the Army. So, yes, Gene, Washington did come up to New England and did replace Artemas. Now, Artemas wasn't completely replaced. Washington kept me as his first major underneath him, major general underneath him. That caused a big problem in our Massachusetts volunteers. From 23,000, it evaporated down to 5,000. Where did those other 18,000 go? Well, they decided they didn't want the hard-nosed Washington, who was court-martialing everybody, and as a result, they didn't want that authoritarian rule. So they decided not to stay in the Army. So.
Yes.
So Washington came after the siege of Boston, is that correct?
After when?
The siege of Boston.
He actually, it's interesting you ask that because he was appointed on the 15th of June, but everything took days for information to come from here to Philadelphia. So they didn't know the Battle of Bunker Hill was 2 days away. So they appointed Washington, and so it wasn't that he was appointed to relieve me because they did a bad job or anything. It's just, that's the way it worked. And then Bunker Hill was on the 17th.
Okay, and then when were the cannons brought through? Is that well after?
Yes, that was in March of '76. Any other question?
Yes.
Maine at the time was part of Massachusetts. Dr. Chamberlain, would you have been involved with him at all?
From Maine, would you have been involved with Josh Chamberlain?
Yeah, Maine?
Yeah.
Maine was Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's what you said.
Wasn't there a general, Dr. Chamberlain, that's very involved in revolutions?
Oh, that was Civil War. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Any other? Yes. Washington was born in 32. I was born in 27. So I was his senior, yeah. But he was taller than I was. What's that?
How long was your commission during the Revolutionary War? Were you involved through the whole Revolutionary War, or did you?
Ward? Yeah, commissions had a certain length. A lot of the soldiers, their commission ran out that were under me by the time winter came in 1775. So that's part of the reason the numbers went down, but they never really came back up. Washington never had more than 10,000 men under his control. But Ward, myself, was involved for the next year until 77, and Ward was in charge of what they called the Eastern Department, which was a greater from here into Boston and down to Rhode Island, and there was no action. And I was getting tired of staying here, and I want to go home. I have a lovely wife and my kids, some of whom were fighting in the Revolution. Actually, my oldest son, Nahum, died. He was shot in the Revolution in 77. Yes, so in 77, my role in the actual military part in Boston and the Revolution basically ended. And I went back to serving in what they call the House of Representatives, which is sometimes called the General Court. It's the group that meet at the State House. You know, that little fixture, little house. It's 2 stories down there in Boston near Faneuil Hall Marketplace. And actually, I became a leader there as well because, I don't know, that just was in my blood. Yeah, so I was the acting governor before John Hancock was officially elected in 1780. And some of you who are lawyers may have been at the General Court or the courthouse in Worcester about 10, 12 years ago when we had the reenactment, the hanging of Bathsheba Spooner. Does anybody, nobody? Okay, well, that's another story, but some of you know of Bathsheba Spooner. So, another question? Yeah.
So, General, you alluded to it with, you know, what a gift it was to spend time at home with your wife and family. I actually have a question for Sarah. You know, what was your impression of your husband as a, you know, father for your children? And if you could give us a little insight about the family at home here in Shrewsbury.
Well, I actually would think Sarah, and yes, would feel certainly that her husband was doing a good job for our country, and he needed to be away, and that's okay, because I was a very capable woman and could take care of the 8 children that we had. Yes.
All by yourself?
All by myself, yes. She and I are that kind of woman. Speaking of the children, for many years after I retired from the teaching, I would go, and Jim would come sometimes with me, into the classrooms in Shrewsbury. And how many children did we have? 8? Yeah, 8 children. And at one time, we would put the name tags on the children, and was one of them Martha? Okay. And that was a fun experience for those children. However, it was a room full of 25 children, and I didn't have 25 children. So only 8 were called forward. One of the children who was there in the classroom, hoping that she would be called to be one of the children, get the name tag on, actually get the bonnet on, and she's a member of this church. Andrea, I'd like you to come up now, sir. And one of her daughters was Martha. So now I'm thinking of you as my daughter, Martha Ward, and I hope this is helpful, and you forgive me for not calling you the first time. It shows, too, how involved the children
Yep.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.